Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about personality disorder. Now, I am not a huge fan of the word disorder, and we'll get more into that in a minute. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about personality and what the field of mental health is doing with it and or what has been done with it. This is going to be a multi-parter, so there is no way for me to feasibly tackle all of personality in one sitting. The goal for today is mostly just how to conceptualize around it, and particularly me arguing for there's a better way to conceptualize it. And the really frustrating thing for me, sometimes on here, this is stuff that I've generated or come to myself, but in this case, this lies solely and proudly in the hands of folks, and many talented folks who have come before me. So this is kind of looking into our past, and there's a lot of great answers for how do we conceptualize personality in our past. So as it stands right now, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, as many folks who watch this might know, has gone through a lot of iterations. It's the same thing with the coding manual for medicine. It goes through tons of iterations. I think it's in its 10th, 11th edition in the medical side. The ICD, on our side, the DSM, it's on the 5 TR, so it's a revised version. And over the years, personality has gone through, I would argue, just a few evolutions. Early on in the DSM, they were actually trimming a lot of personality conditions out of it due to what they posit to be insufficient evidence for it. But over recent editions, or I'd probably say the last several decades, they really haven't done much with it. The closest, if you ever look at a DSM, is they have conditions for further consideration or study, a trait-specified version where they really, for the first time, they took a stab at looking at personality rather than like a mere category. There's lots of different traits that comprise human personality, and how do we specify what traits are in trouble in a way, or not doing as well. And this is the closest the DSM has come to a non-categorical system. And yet that for further study existed for such a long time, and they just released another one after numerous years, and they did nothing. They did nothing to formalize this. And so we're still in this really interesting lurch where the DSM remains, by and large, a categorical system. It says you either have a personality disorder or you do not. And that is a major problem because, I don't know about y'all, human personality is more complicated than it's fine or it's disordered. What it does is it leaves just a ton of people out in no man's land as far as like if there are personality issues that maybe aren't as stark or severe as what would be listed in the DSM, there's nothing to do with it. There's no place to label that. If anything, what the field has begun to do is instead label everything trauma, PTSD, instead of actually looking at what I would argue a good portion of folks who come and have chronic issues around mental health are dealing with personality-related concerns. And we are doing them no service by saying you either have a severe disorder or not. With that categorical system has come a lot of stigma. So with it has come a lot of stigma. And we as providers, I think, collude with the stigma as well. We actively, not all, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of providers steer away from personality-related conditions because it feels so damning. It feels so... it's so severe. A lot of people see it as an immovable object. Providers alike, even myself, despite understanding this broader, less categorical way of understanding personality, I get nervous because just because I think this way, there's nothing out there that says these sorts of things. You go Google and you're not going to find this stuff. If anything, if you find anything at all, it's more kind of like pop psychology versions of personality, which to me are not terribly helpful either. So we have this giant categorical system that is inadvertently, I don't think it was their intention, because they actually, their rationale for removing past personality issues was due to concerns of stigma, one of them in particular, but it's just a clunky, bad system. And I think it's no coincidence that providers and the general public, they tend to only think of personality in this really narrow range. And I'm sure you can think of like, what if I had to ask you, what are the personality disorders that you know of? If you're a provider, your answer might be quite similar than if you are a consumer or part of the general public. What is it, right? Narcissism, of course. Antisocial slash psychopathy. That's a real popular one. Borderline personality disorder. But then there's not a lot else there. Folks don't really go further than that, and I think the reason for that is we've neglected this system, and so people just kind of fill in the blanks, and whatever rises to the top, whatever makes the most sense to people wins, and then the rest just gets neglected. And I think that's a huge it does a huge disservice to the people who come to see us and are looking for health, and it does help, and it does a huge disservice to us as providers because it just binds us. We're really running blind. The second issue with the DSM is it's become increasingly restrictive. As I was kind of alluding to, they've gotten rid of a lot of personality categories. I think some for good reason. They really needed to be studied in greater rigor or refined in some sort of way. But still, there's this inadvertent, and I choose to believe that it's inadvertent. I really think and hope that it's not like, haha, this is garbage, and we're just going to throw it all out, and we're just going to abandon the field of personality psychology. But that's been the inadvertent consequence. It's just like we just keep narrowing it, and we say none of that stuff applies. We're going to go with the medical model. We're going to go with an illness-focused model. And so these personality issues, they're there, but take them or leave them. We're not really touching them or changing them anymore. And so it's just become this like deserted island almost. Again, outside of these few pop psych ones, and it's just neglected, and I think it makes a lot of sense when, especially providers are trying to conceptualize their clients. They look at the personality disorders and they see it as this like this last bastion, this thing that you go to if all else fails. That there's not more room in there to explain the human condition, because it's just this disorder. It's the island of disorders, right? Like you go there if you're lost and you're unsure what to do with the people coming to see you, and maybe it's a personality. It's like, it's sad because it doesn't have to be that way. A lot of people are like, oh, personality, that's so stigmatizing, and they really believe it, and they want to get rid of personality stuff. And it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. Human personality is the seat of who we are, and yet we've created this sequestering. We've encouraged this marooning of personality issues onto this stigmatized island. And there's so many more personality typologies out there that really help, I think, people understand themselves. And I say this from doing psychological assessment. I do assessments on folks, and when people have been in treatment for numerous years, I can usually point to a personality-related concern that isn't really being addressed or really fully understood, because it's an illness model. It's like we need to cure the illness. We need to cure, that you have some sort of illness. You need to be on meds, and you need to, cope better around this, and maybe it'll go away. We hope it goes away. Why are you still in treatment 10 years later? Nobody's going to answer that question. We're just going to keep treating you. And the answer, including how to guide treatment, is in personality psychology, in my opinion. Trauma work has been doing a really good job of filling in some of the blanks, because there are reasonable ties to trauma, but not always. There is biology behind personality too, and we're just neglecting this. We're absolutely neglecting this. So what is out there? What is the option? What alternative do we have? Well, the psychodynamic folks have been studying this for decades, absolute decades. Not always the best, right? So histrionic is a really good example of where the rigor was not sufficient, and it became a very gendered diagnosis, and that's not a good thing. Histrionic personalities still exist in the DSM, and for good reason, but it's just kind of a good illustration of something that we just don't talk about anymore and really put a lot of research into. But the psychodynamic folks have been studying all sorts of things for decades and decades, for better or worse, not always on point. But they offer a really solid model for how to understand personality, and never mind you, they give more of these typologies that providers, when I educate them on them, they're like, oh yeah, I can tell you like 10 clients that I'm dealing with that on, and I haven't known what to do with them. And much like when I talk to clients, they're like, nobody's ever really explained it to me that way. That makes sense. That actually speaks to my experience. That seems to fit me. And I know that's anecdote, right? It's not a research paper, although there's a lot of case studies and stuff on. I point behind me because Psychodynamic manual is back there. There's a good amount of case studies out there, but it's not inconsequential that people respond so openly and so positively to when I frame these things and these conditions to folks. They're like, that's the missing piece. It gives me a name for something. You mean other people experience this kind of cycle too? Yeah. For decades we've been seeing this. Decades. You're not alone. Not even just today you're not alone. You're not alone in annals of time. What they provide. The hard part is how to narrow this. Like, full disclosure, as much as I say I try to do this in single takes, this is one that I have been I have reshot a few times, and I'm not scripting it still, but how do I narrow this in an economical way? So the simplest way is the DSM, like I said, is categorical and it's restrictive. It's eliminated lots of typologies that I think really help explain people's psyches. What the PDM, the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, the psychodynamic folks bring to the table is they provide a long-standing categorical dimensional model. So it's got range to it. But then they also have more expansion, and they will freely say, like, there's not as much support on this, or this one's really been well studied, this one a little bit less, be careful. But they provide a lot more scope and range, but also a lot more depth to it too. It's not just a list of symptoms. They go in detail about that. These are common defenses. These are common sort of genetic temperamental links. These are common ways of seeing oneself and ways of seeing other people, all in the service of trying to provide a more individualized understanding of a human being, as well as how to help that human being. So let's start first with the dimensional aspect of it. And this is probably my favorite thing about it. And it's very humanizing, if you ask me. A categorical model, it's just, there's something about that illness model. Wow, it's nice to have parameters and say, like, okay, we need boundaries around this. Like, trauma is a good example. It's becoming so boundaryless, we're getting into a little bit of trouble. But they still provide boundaries, but they just allow more flexibility, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And so what they say is these personality conditions exist on a continuum of organizational level. And it might sound judgmental at first, but this organizational level is about factors of the human condition. Like, how well are people doing with varying factors of what makes us human, and ideally, when all of them are going well, what makes us quite flexible and thereby healthier. And these are all sorts of things, like capacity for self-regulation. It could even be latent variables such as intelligence. It could be impulse control. It could be distress tolerance. All these really cool variables that we all have inside of us. And when all of them are doing well, our personality tends to be better organized. When one or more are really struggling, we start to struggle and organizational level goes down. There's multiple sub-layers in this, some categories, but I don't think, in past shoots, I tried to explain it, but I don't think it's worth explaining. I think the main thing to emphasize is that it exists on this organizational level, but it's a fluid organizational level. It's not like just extra categories to throw people into. It just says, think about this. And think about where someone might fall, because that's going to tell you a little bit about how much disorganization is going on. And from that, how long in treatment, what might we expect in treatment. It ain't going to be a 12-session CBT, right? The cognitive behavioral therapy. It's going to be longer than that. It could be years. It also guides us on intervention because it says folks at different organizational levels will respond to different types of treatment. And we're not talking like, well, X treatment versus, Z treatment. We're talking about, like, this organization can respond well to structured interventions and supportive interventions, as well as insight-oriented interventions, like really seeking a better understanding of oneself. And they will take that and run with it. Whereas this lower level of organization, or kind of this mid-level, we have to be more careful with insight-focused orientations or interventions, because that might be quite destabilizing for them. So you have to do this sort of work before it to get them to that higher level organization to then do that next level work. And this aligns with one of my other episodes talking about change over time. that folks with lower organizational levels, not always, but it tends to be the lower the organizational level, the more issues they have with all the above: grounding, observation, intentional action, all those sorts of things. And then the other thing that they tell us too is that people can move between these levels. There's this isn't really described elsewhere. It's like organizational level is not a stamp on your forehead saying like this is how you're going to be forever. Now we have to be modest with our expectations and not assume that someone at a really low organizational level is going to go catapulting into a high level organization in like a year. That's not how that works. But I think it gives this sort of capacity for hope, as well as a normalization that people are organized differently. You're not sick or not. We all have these kind of personality components and to varying degrees, they can interrupt our lives, and that's okay. And as we progress through therapy or intervention of any type, the hope is that our organizational level does begin to improve over time. And that's a beautiful thing to me. I don't think that's stigmatizing at all. I think that's very freeing. And I'll share an example later that applies to me. I think it's really important, as I often do, or I try to do in many of these episodes, is apply it to me, that I'm not sitting here with a magnifying glass examining all these other people and go, oh, it's so interesting, but it would never apply to me. No, it absolutely applies to me as well, as a psychologist. Psychodynamic personality psychology 100% applies to me. So I'll go into that. So that's the dimensional nature of it. Very fluid, very inclusive. I think even how they understand the organizational level, it's relatively friendly for across cultures. Not always, because you have to, some of the variables you have to adjust to the culture to make sure you're not like judging, say, like degree of independence. Like, well, independence is going to look different based on the culture, but the point is like you get to individualize that to the culture. It's not saying like this is the way it is, the end. It just says here's a list of things you need to assess, and it's implied like some of those you're going to have to adjust based on the culture within which you're applying it. So I think it's very friendly in that respect too. There's greater inclusivity just from a human perspective, never mind a cultural perspective. Still work to be done, but I believe so. The next thing it does, so that's the categorical versus dimensional. The next one it does is it provides more categories. And this is what I just don't have time to go into because these are supposed to be shorter videos and or shorter episodes. And now I'll probably go into sub episodes that go into each individual one, or maybe clusters that might be quite similar. But just to kind of give it an example of, they still have borderline, right? They still have narcissism. They still have those sorts of things. But even those, they individualize a little bit more. Like narcissism, they talk about the difference between a more malignant type versus a more injured type. But then they have some not at all included. The one I'll go into later is a depressive personality or an anxious personality. Masochism, self-defeating is what it used to be called. It's kind of a subsection. It's interrelated with the depressive personality. They do a good job telescoping out about paranoid personality. So they're really helpful. And there's other measures out there that talk about, like, it's not in the diagnostic manual for the psychodynamic, but a negativism, like negativistic personality. It's one that's filled with sort of resentment and I was wronged by the world. And so they just add a lot of color and shading and depth beyond what the DSM currently provides. And we're not talking like 30 extra. Like, we're not getting excessive here. They really are targeted. But they're incredibly helpful. Every time I read them, I'm like, absolutely, I've met this person before. And it's not captured by our current diagnostic manual. There's no way for me to describe what this psychodynamic manual is trying to describe. It's literally nowhere else to put it. Nowhere else to put it. So hopefully I've gotten people at least a little bit interested and excited here. That not only does it have a humanizing dimensional, it still has restraints around it. It's not like willy-nilly, right? But they have this more humanizing dimensional model, and then they actually include types and styles of personality that really capture a lot of nuance that can cause us grief in our life. And the more we can understand ourselves as human beings, the better we're going to be, in my opinion. So now might be the time to give the example. So again, that's broad strokes. Could go into way more detail as far as the nuance and defining all these, how do they make it dimensional? But that's kind of the gist of what the psychodynamic folks are offering here. So an example, and this example applies to me. So a depressive personality. So as it stands in the DSM, what they have for depression is major depressive disorder. This like for 2 weeks at a time or more. We have, what is it? I think the base is like 3 or 4 symptoms of depression or more, and there's various severity levels, and it comes on, and they can remit for certain amounts of time. And there you go, right? It's a disorder. You have an illness. Whole other episode, like what is illness? Because it's conflated in our diagnostic manual. I promise you it's conflated. There's types of illness that are being conflated is what I mean. We also have persistent depressive disorder, a very tragic renaming if you ask me. It used to be called dysthymia, a beautiful word to really capture this sort of chronic lower grade depressivity. But that chronicity is really important because just because it can come with less severe overtly reported symptoms doesn't mean it's less severe subjectively, because chronicity, for anybody who's had chronic health conditions can tell you, especially things like chronic pain, just because it's lower, the nagging nature of it, the unrelenting nature of it is its own version of it's its own challenge. So they have those, and then they have other specified. So our diagnostic manual, for those of you who aren't providers, we have these other specified, which are basically the catch-all categories of like, if it doesn't fit in these major ones, but it's still in this family, you can diagnose it. So, kudos to the DSM folks, the psychiatrists, predominantly psychiatrists and other folks on those panels, because they do give us an out, but it's just such a broad, nameless category. A lot of people really don't anchor in it. And that's all they give us. You have an illness, you have a disorder, and typically what comes with that is like, let's get you on some meds because you need to manage this illness, or you need to cope better, and maybe this illness, we need to cure this illness. And there's a degree of freedom to that, this idea of like, something happened to you, it doesn't define you, and we need to find something that either remedies it the best we can, or maybe we can cure it. But to me, there's an undercurrent of pathologizing and stigmatizing that is going on with that ideology. And I know this might be a twist for some people who've already considered this, especially providers, is like, well, you're arguing that like personality is better? Like that's super, no. If you use the current personality model, then yeah, it sounds way worse and way more stigmatizing. But if you, again, think of it as like a more global human experience, to me, instead of saying you have an illness, say like your personality is inclined towards depression. This depressive personality disorder, which runs the gamut of organizational level. You can be highly organized, kicking butt and taking names in life, all sorts of stuff. Then you can be, lower levels of organization, struggling, trying to work through this, trying to claim just a little bit of land, some sturdy ground for you to stand on. And everything is valid. And all that is valid. All that is absolutely valid and explainable. I think it's most validating for folks who've dealt with these concerns chronically, because when you combine illness with chronicity, I think people start to take on this identity of like, I'm sick and I'm going to be sick forever. And, I think there's compassion in that, not to expect oneself to be on top of the game all the time, but also comes this like helplessness of like, why am I not getting better? Well, when you throw it out there as like a personality issue where there's incremental growth and there's shifting in those organizational levels, to me, it feels far more accessible. If it's a journey, and it's not an illness that you're just it's supposed to go away, because that's that analog with the medical field that just isn't helpful. And so the folks in the PDM, the psychodynamic folks, say this depressive personality has been around for a long time, and it speaks to a really chronic, unrelenting depression. It's probably closest to that PDD, the persistent depressive disorder that I said earlier. I'm sure there's major depressive disorder, or heaven forbid, we're allowed to get really suddenly depressed for a little bit of time, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there are people really with some sort of biological interesting thing going on that's predisposing them to depression. I'm not arguing that. However, I would argue a good 50% of folks struggling with depression or kind of working through depression in their lives, chronic depression, it's a personality issue. Applies to me. I believe myself to be this way. And so the way to describe it is these folks often have more sensitive temperaments overall. That there is just something about them that's really attuned to their environment. And so they're more susceptible to adversity as things come along their way, or they're more sensitive just to cues in general that maybe other people would just go, I felt that, but no, I don't need to anchor in that. And with that, it's especially troubling when like traumatic experiences happen because they're already really permeable to their environment, right? Like a lot of things can come in emotionally and affect their sense of themselves and others. You topple trauma on top of that, well, it's going to really mess with their organizational level. Not always. Human resiliency should not be underestimated. A lot of folks can deal with all sorts of trauma and come out the other side doing pretty damn well. However, when trauma does occur, there's a greater risk there for someone who's already a little bit biologically predisposed. And I see this in myself. A lot of folks who meet me say, or would think and get the impression that this guy's real stoic. He's, pretty unflappable. He's on top of his game, blah, 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 blah. But underneath the surface, I'm all over the place. I am very sensitive and very reactive to my environment. And so when I was encountering difficulties growing up, I started to get really distorted understandings of myself and others, what psychodynamic folks call object relations. And so I started dealing with depression around age 8, 9, or 10. Obviously not the same as it is now, but it's kind of when it began. And then social anxiety came a la carte. I think those often go hand in hand due to sensitivities, right? Really being sensitive to the environment. And the experiences. And then the experiences begin to compound on themselves. It's real sad processes as we start to believe that, the fundamental belief being like something is wrong with me and that people who get to know me really won't like me, the real me, not the outside me, but like the real me won't like me. And what that unfortunately does, this underlying personality development, is it then starts to mess with behavior that pulls people away from experiences that might delegitimize those beliefs and those ways of seeing oneself. And they develop defenses, rigid defenses that kind of get in the way of getting better. And the psychodynamic folks just lay this out on a platter and say, this is the common problem here. And so what you're doing is you're working with somebody's identity. You're not solving symptoms. Symptoms are the manifestation of an underlying problem with identity/personality. And that's something we can work with, but we're not going to work with it the same way that these, more evidence-based things say, where it's just like, we're going to tackle the symptoms and make the symptoms better. And the symptoms get better, then everything gets better. Well, yeah, well-organized folks, if you help the symptoms, you might help them out of some of these personality-related issues because it just gives them just enough freedom to move through this neurosis, as we call it, in the personality world. So great on them. But even then, not everybody at a higher organizational level is actually going to solve that problem. They just learn to cope around it better, but the problem keeps repeating itself. It keeps coming up. They just manage it better. Wouldn't it be cool to tackle the underlying problems, try to get that to stop coming up so much? Or for them to tackle it and more than just adjusting around symptoms, but really a deeper understanding of oneself and working with that sort of like, I understand this part of me. I understand this part of my identity. Welcome back. I understand who you are. I know how to play with you now. You're a part of me, but you're a part of me I have to be wary of. And I think that's just a way more freeing methodology. But even, when we get to lower levels of organization, again, there's a greater freedom in it of saying like this has been something that's been baked in over time and it's been growing over time and you've gotten stuck in it. This is also why narrative-based therapies, ones that really go through people's, their existential development, their identity developments, their attachment, whatever you want to call it, their family system, are really helpful because you're helping them better understand who they are, so then they understand why and what they're trying to target in the change. This is different than a lot of methods is just say, here's the problem and here's how you need to change, but the change isn't really prescriptive to their unique situation, nor is it prescriptive to their narrative and understanding why did I get to be this way. Like how should I change in a way that hopefully avoids the things that are going to cause this again if I don't understand why it developed or the narrative behind it in the first place. The thing I often say to folks of my psychodynamic approach is like, you've got the book of you. In the book of you, there's a lot of chapters that have already been written. And here you are in the present trying to rewrite the current chapter, but it's all determined by the past chapters. It builds upon itself. It's a narrative. And so it's really important, especially under, thinking about personality psych, to go back and understand those earlier chapters of like what was going on that led us to the present day, so that we can write these chapters in the present in a more intentional way. We're not going to just like suddenly insert in chapter 32 and say like, all right, new coping mechanisms. You're going to be good, right? After you're done coping? Like, no. I mean, it can make it temporarily better, but it's not going to change the overlying narrative. You have to look back and say like, from whence did I come so I know where I head? And that's kind of the whole point. And that's why the psychodynamic theories of personality are so accessible. And under this kind of depressive lens, it says, you've got to work on like, where is this core self coming from? I mean, cognitive behavioral stuff flirts with this. It just doesn't, I think, go in as much depth and as much detail as it could. And like, there's something that happened along the way that had you lose sight of these other parts of self and really dive into this ideology, something in this depressive realm. And let's describe and really individualize it to you of like, where is this depressive personality coming from? And so for myself, I had my own journey in this. And if someone tried to just symptom focus me right in the present, I'd be like, great, I know how to cope better. But you know what would happen 3 weeks from then? It'd be back. And I'd be like, great, here it is again. Now I need to cope again. And then come back again. Fuck, I got to cope again. It comes back again. I'm like, I am so tired of trying to cope with this thing. I know how to do it, but it's not going away. Why won't it go away? Whereas if somebody approached me from like a personality psych lens, it's like, understand this part of you. There's something, it's just a part, but you've made it into a dominant part, and you need to understand it better and try to nurture these other parts that were lost along the way. Chip away at some of these defenses that are keeping you away from these other healthier parts. And that's aided through a personality lens. Now, folks who do trauma work will say, like, this sounds a lot like trauma work. And that's why, as much as I think we are wildly overextending the definitions of trauma as well as the diagnostic qualifications for PTSD, the cool thing is at least their treatment is somewhat friendly to this, because they talk so much about like discover the narrative, understand the narrative behind the symptoms so that you can be more intentional with what's going on in the present day. So I don't know if that was like that's not necessarily personal. I could have gone in more detail, but that's kind of the whole idea of a depressive personality is like, there's a chronicity to it because it's linked to biology and temperament, and it's linked to ways in which we learn to see ourselves over time. And around that, unhealthy defenses were created that tend to keep us stuck. And if you just focus on the symptoms, you're going to miss every single one of those. You might address like a core, erroneous cognition or something by happy accident, but it usually doesn't lead to longitudinal change because you're not really tending to the undercurrent of it all. So just to recap, that's again a quick and dirty. It really is not doing it justice. Is DSM, the current diagnostic manual, highly categorical, highly restrictive, and inadvertently quite stigmatizing. Whereas we have a psychodynamic option right there, decades worth of research, decades worth of just talented folks feeding into this understanding of personality, saying, hey, I've got a more dimensional, humanizing way. And I've got some extra personality types that might describe you or the human condition way, way better. And I think it's a wonderful system. So for those of you watching on video, I got this nice like light thing right here, right? So good timing. This one was shot later in the day. It's right there on the teeth. Nice. Anyway, as usual, I hope this has been interesting. It gets you at least kind of looking around, wanting to sift around a little bit, look at these psychodynamic methods. There we go. Look at these psychodynamic methods, see if it speaks to you as a provider, or if you're someone who's a consumer, see if it speaks to you there too. Because I think it worst case, even if somebody doesn't pull a diagnostic trigger on it, well, maybe you could just read about it and understand yourself a little bit more, robustly through that lens. So, I hope it's been helpful. And as ever, stay curious. Thanks so much.